that I've organized as the program director. So I see all the participants as like, this is a personal endorsement of me that you showed up. I don't know. That's how I'm interpreting
It's true.
this.
We're so happy.
So I'm going to be really quick because you all signed up. You know what today's panel is about. It's about creating meaningful engagement with Latinx Utahns. And I am so delighted that we have the three panelists we do today. Our moderator, who is going to jump in and give us her thoughts because they're so valuable, is Senator Luz Escamilla. She needs very little introduction. Just a reminder, she is serving in her 4th term in the Utah State Senate. Quick aside, I was the president of the Utah National Organization for Women when I was doing my master's degree. And I remember Senator Escamilla asked us for an endorsement and we met for lunch and she walked in and just there was nothing crossed her face to give this away, but I was like, she's got to be so disappointed that I'm like this 24-year-old, like, sure, we'll endorse you. We just like spun the club back up. But she treated us with just the utmost respect and sincerely asked for our endorsement. And I will never forget that. I kept your thank you letter for years. I think I still have it. So thank you for being here today. And then we have Paola Lynette, a student activist, immigrant, and first-generation college student at the University of Utah studying international studies. We also have Cristina Bolanos from Voto Latino. She enjoys volunteering as a paralegal for No Mas, a nonprofit that helps immigrants with legal immigration proceedings. I'm going to turn it over to you three. If anybody has questions throughout, just drop them in that chat and we'll get to them at the end.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Chelsea, for that introduction and for remembering those little moments. And as you've been exposed this morning by all the candidates, they are what makes you wake up the following day and continue knocking on doors and asking for money and doing the things that you need to do. So thank you for remembering that. It makes a huge difference. I'm always honored to be participating of this great group of incredible women. I've had my very first encounter at 29 when I was running for the Senate for the first time. So I completely outdated myself. Now you guys know how old I am. But I mean, it was 13 years ago when I've been elected for 13 years, and 14 years ago I was knocking on doors like many of you are today. So I have my utmost respect for all of you for doing this, for running for office, for being engaged, for being the ones that wake up in the rainy morning on a Saturday morning and walk with a candidate when you can't get that many volunteers. Please know it makes a huge difference. And it also makes a difference when we are addressing our fastest growing population in the state of Utah, which happens to be individuals in the communities that identify themselves as Latino, Latinas, Hispanic, Latinx, Latina. So you guys can pick. I don't think anyone is going to get offended by any of those terms, and they're evolving. And I can't catch up with my teenagers anymore on the terms, but I'm trying my best. But just know that, as the terms change, it's a cultural identity. It's many of us. We come from different racial backgrounds. So that's part of the richness of this community, is that you may have different, different racial backgrounds and people identifying themselves as Latinos or part members of Latinx community. But I think it's just so we're aware in the last, at least from what I've been following, the last more than 30 years, we've continued to be the fastest growing community in the state of Utah. And on this new census data that came out, which as we know is, we will be undercounted, unfortunately, due to COVID. It really was one of the biggest concerns for the Latino community and leaders was the undercounting in the middle of a pandemic, when there was so much fear, and of course under a transition of a terrible administration, which was Trump's administration, that made it very difficult for people to come out and fill out a form when it came to the census, because he actually was threatening them with an immigration component to the questionnaire, which it took leadership to take it all the way to courts and be able to protect that piece of privacy of individuals so they can be counted, which they should. So I mean, even then, you're now going to see this very large number of Latinos. We continue to be the largest one in the state of Utah, and I don't think that will change anytime soon. And the biggest growth, and I'll just mention this before we get into the amazing speakers, because I think they reflect some of these conversations, is many of these this growth is based on fertility rate. So the growth is not only migration, it's really these communities happen to have very large families, which in Utah is unheard of, right? I mean, how do we compete against, white women in Provo? Well, we do. And we actually have more kiddos. I'm still 1.5 behind. Don't think I'm going to catch up, but I let all the other beautiful Latina women catch up on that fertility rate. But I just mentioned that because I think it's critical that we understand that this growth, and when we talk about this specific group of individuals being the really, they just make sense to be Democrats and to vote for Democrats when it comes to elections. They are, very young. Many of them may be potentially the first ones to vote in their household and in their family, which means a lot, and it's actually a big responsibility. And I'm sure the speakers will get into what that means in a minute. But just understanding that also becomes an issue of how they're going to vote and why they vote is not only because of them, and they have now this amazing ability to be 18 and being able to circle a box on a ballot. It means a lot more for them and their families. So I just want to put that there is that emotional connection to this process as well. And I just want to do a shout out because I think as you guys were having a conversation with candidates, someone mentioned Annabelle as someone that is, that was everywhere. And I say that I want to mention Annabelle and thank her because part of why also as Latinos, we struggle sometimes feeling welcome and feeling that we are included and that we can get the support and get elected is, it makes it so great when you have individuals like Annabelle that's been a great ally to our community. I know she's been adopted as Mexican. She doesn't know yet. She'll get that birth certificate soon as well. You can have dual citizenship, Annabelle, so there. But, she's just been wonderful. It's people that don't question, just go and do it. They're the doers of this club as well, right? I mean, is being the doer. So with that, so my first question as we get now into the panelists, and of course, we'll start with Cristina, and I know Cristina for a long, long time when she was just a very young student. And of course, I was too young, but not as young as she is. But she's been working with our community for a long time, and I've seen her growing in her positions and her roles. And people follow her because they deeply care about what she's doing. They see her working in the community. But Cristina, why don't we start with you and talking about those changing demographics? How do you think the Utah Democrats can make sure that us as Latino and our Latinx voices are being included, and how does that affect the future of Utah?
Yeah, well, thank you again, everyone, for having me here, and thank you, Luz, for introducing me. And I just need to give her a shout out, say that she's amazing, and I've admired her ever since she ran for the position was exactly back then, but I know she ran for something super important. I believe it was like a representative, and she's just amazing, and I'm just very honored to be with her here today and with the rest of you. To answer your question, I think it's super important to, first of all, do your very best effort to build those relationships with the Latinx community. Building relationships is key. It's the first step that we should all make sure we take in order to get closer to the community and also understand where everyone is coming from in this particular situation. Others understanding where we're coming from, why we're here, and why we really want to contribute to our community, because we're here wanting to contribute to our community, wanting to contribute to the good cause, which is to do good in this world, right? And so I think that's very important to do. Also, leadership positions involving the Latinx, the Latino community in leadership positions is vital. Like you mentioned, it's been hard, and it still is, although I feel like it's improving. Trying to feel as a Latina or Latino or Latinx represented or welcome. I feel like we've had to really fight for that for a long time, and we continue to fight. And so having others as allies it's super important for us to be able to keep contributing and keep being that representation and that voice for not only our community, but for others, women, children, the vulnerable communities. I think that's key.
Thank you, Cristina. And now, Paola, do you mind chiming in with the same question, just that Utah demographics and really how do Utah Democrats make those communities feel included, and how will that have a difference, obviously, in the outcomes of what we're seeing in our state?
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Women's Democratic Club, and thank you, Senator Luz Escamilla and Chelsea for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And yes, I was thinking that first of all, we might need to recognize the challenges that we face. Like Alejandro Puy was mentioning at the beginning, some of our families work 2-3 jobs, and they are too busy to really get engaged in politics and get engaged in leadership positions. But I know that we can make some efforts as well to maybe join community events that we have, or visit our schools, our neighborhoods, and come and talk to our people and hear the challenges that we are facing, hear their stories, and really like do whatever we can to gain legitimacy. And in that way, we the Democratic Party can gain the support from our people.
Excellent. And thank you so much, Paola, for those remarks. And as we continue to now, we recognize certain dynamics within the community. I've now decided to see everything from the lens of social determinants of health, whether it's politics, whether it's a public policy conversation, whether we're talking about immigration or health. Social determinants of health is what's really determining people's outcomes. Unfortunately, your zip code, where you live, what levels of education you have, whether you live in a place where you have access to healthy food or not. Those food deserts are a reality for many of our communities. Alejandro, I know, is running on the west side of Salt Lake City, which is part of my district, and he certainly knows what I'm talking about when we say, those social determinants of health sometimes is what's determining people's actions, right? I mean, what they do every morning, whether there's 2 to 3 jobs, like Paola was saying, or whether they, you feel that you're welcome in a group as you're trying to move in positions of leadership, like Cristina mentioned before. But now, to Paola and Cristina, the messaging of the Democrats moving forward has sometimes been missing the mark, to say the least. I mean, I think they, as Democrats, there has been a history of, just kind of like taking for granted the Latino vote. It's there. Historically, of course, we tend to be maybe a little bit more progressive on certain issues as we seek, especially immigration reform seems to be an issue that Democrats have been more friendly to our gente, to our familias. Not all the time, but historically they have. But what happens when they're missing the mark, or when they just take it for granted and they said, well, this is our budget and we're only spending very, very small amounts on this community, if any, right? If it's even recognized. What happens, and what can those leaders do across the state to really gain the trust and the ability to say, we have the Latino vote with us, they are part of our community? What needs to happen, Cristina?
Yeah, for sure. I think, like you mentioned, and everyone mentioned here, it's very important, first of all, to understand the issues that are impacting our community, because as how it is impacting the rest of the community, the white community, Black community, it's also impacting the Latino community. Health, you mentioned health, it's super important. We are always fighting for those rights, or for that representation within the health department. I mean, tons of Latinos don't have insurances, and insurance itself, it's really hard to obtain here in the United States. It can get expensive, especially if you don't know the information behind it or how to look into it. So that's very important to understand. that just as it's impacting the rest of the community, that it's also impacting the Latinos. And also representation, I'm just gonna go back to it, is super important. Invite community, what the Democratic Party here in Utah can do is to invite those representatives, those Latino leaders to events or even workshops or any other event that they might be thinking of creating to speak about the current issues. That way, not only Latinos can be more knowledgeable of how this is impacting them, but also the rest of the communities as well. And so I feel representation is super key. And so if the Democratic Club or Democrats here in Utah really want to understand a little bit more where we come from and why it's super important for us to be involved, is I think leadership and inviting those leaders to the conversations is key.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christina. Paola, you're next. And I want to just mention, as you talk about this messaging and you feeling, us being able to feel included, just a shout out to the fact that you were testifying in committee in one of my bills, which thank you for sharing your personal story and your family's story, which is not comfortable. And you did such a good job. So even if you don't mind sharing a little bit of that experience, because I think as Democrats, if being able to recognize those voices, even in situations like testifying for a bill, I think it's critical. So go ahead.
Yes, it was last spring that we were pushing. We wanted to pass this bill that would give children from 0 to 21 years old access to healthcare here in the state of Utah without any extra cost. And I thought it was so important to advocate for that, because I think that COVID-19 just show up like all the inequalities that we had in here, not only in Salt Lake City, but also in the whole state. And it showed how while our families were working in the front line in person, they didn't have any days off, or maybe other families lost their job, families who were not able to work from home, and they were exposed every single day to COVID-19, and our families were exposed. In my personal stories, my mom, who had and has 2 jobs, she had to work every single day, just putting at risk her health, and also my siblings' health and myself. And when I think it was 5 years ago that my little sister got sick, we needed to take her to the emergency room. After that visit, my parents needed to pay more than $5,000 because of that visit to the doctor. It was really expensive and unexpected and almost impossible to pay for my family. And I know that I'm not the only one. There are thousands of families here in the state of Utah who need and have the right to have access to healthcare and visit the doctor and do regular checkups. And that is something that we need to keep fighting for and advocating for, because it is so important. Or even me, when I want to go to the doctor, it's like, I don't know if I should stay home or I should go, just because of the cost, and that shouldn't be a problem for us.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. And I just want to add into this part of the conversation about messaging. And many of the individuals that are participating in today's call, they are in this Zoom meeting, are candidates themselves. And let me tell you, because we've all, I've been there multiple times. I've lost twice, so it's not the best. Losing sucks. I still have PTSD from that, but especially in the last election. But I'll say this. Our tendency when this is new, your first time running, or even if it's not your first time running, your tendency is to go with the experts. Of course, there's people that campaign for a living, and they're great professionals in this field, and it's a tough business to be in because it's seasonal, as you can see from election cycles. But I've always seen that there's this huge gap, right, of the experts on targeting specific groups. And I really recommend that if you are interested in putting within your campaign plan, a strategy regarding this community that you actually reach to members of this community. And I say that respectfully to people that have done this for many years and have succeeded in certain areas. But I can tell you, you can read it from miles away and smell it when you know it was now someone from the Hispanic Latino community putting a plan in place, the messaging, even the translation, is not correct. The feel is not correct, and just don't waste your money on something that's just not going to be effective, and you potentially could insult a community. Now, is everyone want to be an expert? And just because you happen to have a Spanish surname doesn't mean you're an expert in the diversity within the Hispanic Latinx community. So that's another issue. Recognizing the fact that we are a very diverse community within our community. Like I said, you could have, different racial groups. Being Hispanic Latino is an ethnicity, it's not a race. So that brings certain dynamics. 24 countries speak Spanish, which is one of the things that kind of like brings us together as Hispanic Latinos. So there are many other cultural identities that make one of us who we are. And so you can't get like a booklet that says, so this is what Latinos do, right? That just doesn't work. Generalizing like that and putting people in boxes like that is very difficult and you will not succeed. But I mean, make an effort to bring members of those communities. Like I think Christina has been really clear that would just make you have better outcomes through this process. So in that same sense, so one is you don't want to insult. And so I've seen people say, Luz, I'd rather not do anything because I'm so afraid that I'm going to be, insulting someone or being disrespectful to a culture. And then you get canceled and, it's scary stuff now, right? I mean, social media has made it that you don't want to say anything if you don't want to be have thousands of hits the next day on something that puts you in a really bad place. So I recognize that now the challenge is how do we do this without saying the wrong term, using the wrong wording. So again, when people trust you, when the community have seen you and they know you're coming in good faith and from your heart, I think it's pretty obvious. So don't come only in the middle of an election cycle. If that's all, of course, if you're first time running, this is it. But if you've been elected and only when there's an election cycle and you need the pictures when you call someone, it's kind of like, oh, thanks for just using me. I mean, it just looks too obvious. So I build those relationships, start with your community. And clearly our Hispanic Latinx communities everywhere. I mean, we're parents, we're mothers, we're essential workers. Many of our gente are essential workers. We have children, we have grandkids, we have everything, right? I mean, we're like everybody else. So you'll have those opportunities to interact. But I do want to say, just going back now to our panelists, what is it, one or two things that you believe the Democratic Party can do to make sure we don't lose those voters? Christina, we'll start with you. I mean, what could happen right now, especially the millennials and those younger 18 to 25, which is where many of our I call them kiddos because they're my kids' age, which is super scary. So we don't lose their vote, we don't lose them participating and engaging in this process.
That's right. It's super important, to keep in mind all ages, all demographics, not just those that can vote, right? And so, like Luz said, I mean, there's the young ones that can't vote right now, but that they are preparing to vote and they are learning about voting and they are the future of this country. And so it's super, super vital for them to understand first who the candidates are, who they represent, what their values are, and also what the voting process looks like. And so for example, I feel like I could have done so much better, and also other people around me at teaching me more about voting, right? When I was a younger or a teenager or a kid. Because by the time, I turned 18, 21, I was ready to vote, but how do you do it, And so I feel like the voting process can look very complicated, but in reality, it's really not. It only takes 3 minutes to vote, right? Or to sign up to vote. And so it's super important to keep them in mind and instructing them and educating them when young. Also, you also have people that are unable to vote for X, Y, and Z, right? They're undocumented, or they just cannot for any other reason. And so but their voices are just as important as those that are able to vote. So what you can do as candidates or as the Democrats of this state is to keep them in mind, and also encourage them to encourage their friends and families to vote, right? Because they also want to be part of this community. They would love to vote, but because of several reasons they can't, but they want to be part of this community, and they are. And so it's very important to include them and also encourage them and to participate, right, in those events that you have, voting events or registration events and stuff like that. So it's very important to keep them in mind and include them.
That's great. Thank you, Christina. And you're absolutely right. The call to action makes a big difference. You want them to feel that they belong. And even if they're not allowed, they can't vote for whatever reason that is, that they still have an opportunity to participate. I think that was one of also within the panel questions is, how do we don't lose that? Because, by the way, data shows that, we know this for a fact, especially when 18-year-olds vote for the first time, the individual that they're going to call to ask them who do they vote for is their parents, right? So even if we have a lot of these kiddos are now becoming, they're US born children and from mixed status families, meaning the parents may have different immigration statuses, not all of them undocumented. They could be in a legal permanent residency situation, which takes years for you to become a citizen. They are still gonna call their parents probably to ask that question. So engage, everyone. And we do that. I mean, we know kids, those 18-year-olds, that's why sometimes when you see that, yeah, they may be on TikTok and they may be, clicking and supporting and liking all of these more progressive issues, and they still voted Republican, for example, and you're like, what just happened? They actually call their parents. And so parents have a huge influence. For our Latinos, parents have a huge influence. It's very connected in who we are, to have, this very respectful relationship with our parents. And you don't disconnect that easily from your parents. So even if those parents are not able to vote, having them educated on the process is critical, because they will have a huge influence on their children. So Paola, I'll let you add, and I know you're very young, so you can probably add to some of that younger component as well.
Yes, what I noticed is that some of my friends, they were not encouraged to vote because they were saying things like, oh, I don't even know the candidates, for example, for local elections, or I don't even know where to register, or like, where do I go? And I was like always wanting to make sure that my friends who were eligible to vote were voting. So I was literally telling them where to go, passing the link, or where the offices were at. But some of them just like didn't want to vote because they sometimes candidates and politicians make promises that at the end of the day they cannot complete those promises, right? So they feel discouraged in that way, and which causes like voter inequality, are like the registration requirements sometimes, or like early registration information and all of those things. And that's basically all for young voters. That is what I have noticed, the lack of information about elections.
Absolutely. And I think this is a good transition to our next and last question before we have Q&A, because I do want to engage our the individuals in this meeting. But the question is, who has been effective, and are there any effective ways of reaching to this community? And I'm going to start actually saying that we've had incidents, and I see many of our Latino community leaders participating in this call, where we've had it just happened actually, I don't want to say maybe 2 years ago, where there was an event that was put together by the Republican Party. I know it was like super odd, and they had all these Latino participants. It was just this bizarro moment, right? I'm like, what just happened? And I learning, and we did some investigation, right? Like what was taking place, because we felt it was very deceiving, the way their outreach was happening and what they were telling people. But the first thing I noticed was like, wait, the Republican Party actually reach out. They actually put together a whole plan. Personally, to me, it was deceiving in the way, some of the wording, but at the end of the day, they never not disclosed the fact that they were the Republican Party. They used Latinos to get 2 Latinos, and they actually had about 100 people, which to me was, and very young Latinos. So it was one of those moments where, to me, it just reminded me that we can sleep and just take for granted that vote and that support. And I'm coming as a member of this party and as someone that's been active in politics for many, many years, since I was in college, like Paola, a young student at the University of Utah, as a new immigrant to this country, as a new American. I was knocking on doors for many other candidates that I admire and respected, but there was always that huge gap that I felt I needed to do, more just to prove myself. So, it took me a minute to say, wait, we were upset. There was some, we did some reactionary stuff and to try to be proactive to make sure that didn't happen again. At least our community was aware that there were some, to me, they were masquerading some of their messaging. But I thought, interesting that the Republican Party make this huge effort, and you can tell it was planned ahead and it was just strategic. There was funding involved. They put their money where their mouth is. So, I don't know that that's the best example for me to talk about successful messaging components. Just one more thing that I'll say, I've been through multiple governors' races. I usually run for my senatorial races at the presidential election years, which is where the governor also runs. So I've had the chance to be on the ballot with, the president and the governor races. And, I've seen very different approaches to the governor's races. And I put a plug to Alejandro, because Alejandro was managing, I think, Mike Weinholz's campaign. And I don't know if Alejandro's still on the call, but oh, there he is. So yeah, Alejandro was managing Mike Weinholz's campaign, and it was very strategic. He came to me and asked if we could have my family participate on their ad. And it took me forever to convince, especially the older kids, that we're not that comfortable. We still have that commercial. It's, the infamous Mike Weinholz commercial. But I've never had that up. It was very strategic. It was very intentional. It was unapologetic, and they were putting their money where their mouth is. And clearly there's more to any campaign strategy when it comes to ads and marketing. Okay. So I'm by no means an expert on any of them because I haven't participated in any of those campaigns, but I just want to say there was an intention. It was very obvious. I think that ad had a lot of likes. I got a lot of compliments for saying, oh, Mike Weinholz, instead of him trying to speak Spanish when he couldn't speak Spanish, he actually brought someone that the community identified with and used that person to connect. So Alejandro, I know it was you more than anybody in your group doing it, but I just mentioned that as an example of something that to me has been very different from everybody else in my last 20 years involved in the party. So anything that you want to add, Christina, in that sense, or Paola? We'll start with Christina.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting that you mentioned, Luz, that the Republican Party was super involved at that time. And, they've included the young Latino vote or Latino leaders. And sometimes you don't expect that, but sometimes that could serve you as a good example, right? Especially for a party that wants to be involved and wants to support the Latino community, and that they could ultimately identify with them. Well, personally, so while participating with the Voto Latino chapter in Utah for the past 2 years, the girls who were in the presidency back then, they're no longer with us, unfortunately, but they did such an amazing job. Valeria and Nadia, they were just outstanding at putting everything together, and they've just made such a big difference. Thanks to them, we've had a lot of our community register to vote and help out with these campaigns and activities that have been so essential to get the word out. But we've partnered up with Voteris. I'm not sure if you are familiar with it, but Voteris is an organization here in Utah that it's super good. They have done a lot to get the word out about the importance of voting. We've partnered up with them several times within the past few years, and we've gone to public places, the flea markets, and we've made sure that we encourage people to vote. So it's super important. They've also been allies to us in the Hispanic community, and even though their background's different from us, we've all found a common ground. And I think it's super important as you candidates, you go through this whole experience to learn from this, and other people that are willing to unite and also partner up with the Latinx community. You can also do the same. We've had a GOTV women campaign about 2 years ago, where we use social media to encourage women to vote, especially women of color. We have different techniques to get them involved, get them feel welcome, and let them know that they are important. Women are vital to our community. So that's just an example of an organization that has been super good to us and super supportive.
Excellent. Paola?
Cristina, I also met Valeria, and she's the one who registered a lot of my friends and encouraged them to vote, as well as some family members. So organizations such as Voto Latino are so helpful for our community. Communities United, and they also have a program, Vote for Two, encourage Latinx families to register to vote. And for me personally, I think it will be great if the Democratic Club could maybe, or Democratic Party, I'm sorry, invite our families to join events and town halls, and maybe visit workplaces, schools, hear the story of our families. And just to be honest with you, as a non-eligible voter, I sometimes feel discouraged, even though I am highly involved. Sometimes feels like I depend on someone else who can support me and my family to have a chance to be heard or recognized. So I'm always telling my friends and family, checking on them if they're voting, or I'm also joining these events or joining other organizations and supporting their efforts, and encourage families to vote, or those who are permanent residents who can apply for citizenship, because that is one of the most important things. And in the last few months, I've been working with Communities United, and I have been able to see the challenges that our community faces. But I am so grateful that I have met an incredible community and been able to work with wonderful people who have supported me as a student and as a person and as an immigrant. And I'm so grateful for that. So that's everything. Thank you.
Well said, Paula. Thank you so much for that, and for your courage to be involved, even you're not allowed to participate fully. And I've been there, so as someone that's been there, where you can't vote but you're still knocking on doors for people. I would just add, before we go on question and answer, so hopefully start thinking about your Q&As, we do have some time here, that I remember something that's notable is that we are members of our Latinx community are also professionals, and our students also need to pay for rent and school. And the number one reason why we have very few Latinos when they graduate from school and college going into internships is they can't afford it. They have to be working, because there are many of them helping their families financially. So if you can have internships, make sure that they're paid internships, and that there's an opportunity for our young Latinos to fully participate in a way that they can be compensated in a fair manner, not necessarily more, but just fair. And many of our youth cannot participate because at a very young age they have to be engaged in the labor force because of need. So with that, I'm very happy to now open for questions. So if you can raise your virtual hand, and I'm going to try my best here, more than happy to answer, to get your questions. Anyone? It's a pretty quiet group. I mean, I beat this as beating the legislature, guys, so I'm happy to be here.
Terry
Okay, we have
Vidal.
one. Okay, we'll start with Terry. Terry, go ahead.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for this presentation and thank you for all the speakers. I have a real question for Christina about Voto Latino because we've been trying to work with the Wasatch Latino Coalition in Wasatch County. And, you know, I work with League of Women Voters in the Wasatch Back to do registration, and we kind of got off track because of COVID. And we're looking at how to get activated again in registering voters. And the best that we can come up with is using the local churches, especially at the Catholic Church, before masses, after masses. Do you have any recommendations, or can you shoot me your email and I'll talk to you later about it?
Yeah, for sure, Terry. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I have quite a few ideas I can share with you. I will share my email on here, but I think, yeah, getting activated, I mean, it's never too late. It's never too late to start again. And that's what we've actually been trying to do. The structure of our club has changed in a national level. As you all know, I mean, Voto Latino exists in every state, almost every state here in the US. And so we're also trying to change quite a few things. And with COVID, everything kind of has changed, and we're doing a lot of our work online now. But yeah, I will share information with you, and I'll type my email on here.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you for your commitment. I mean, that's what makes a difference. I see Representative Carol Spackman-Moss has her hand raised, so take it away, Representative.
Hi, Luz. Thanks so much for coming, and the other speakers as well. It's excellent. My question has to do with language, not surprisingly. The term Latinx, I've actually read some articles saying that older Latinos don't particularly like that term. And so language is evolving. We know that. I'd like to use the right terminology. And then my second part of the question is, and when do you say Hispanic? So would you explain that or give your perspective?
Absolutely. I'm going to start, and then I'll let the other two young women also add into this. That's a great question, Carolyn. So there's not a right or wrong answer. So here's the safest one. So for years, we've been very safe on saying Hispanic, Latino. So here, the difference is Hispanic is anyone that speaks, there's Spanish descent, and Latinos that are in Latin America. So if you go Hispanic, then you're excluding, obviously, Brazil and, Spain, ironically, and Portugal, for example. So, but if they're Latino, then you include them all. So your safest way is Hispanic. Latino is actually what the federal government uses, which is why some, for example, at one point were very resistant. It was brought by the Nixon administration, and there is some historical context of some racism behind it. So that's why for a while it was resistant. Most people identify themselves as Hispanic Latinos just so they are covered. The Latinx term, and you're absolutely right, is very young. And now my 16-year-old uses Latina. So like their new group at school is Latina. In a little bit of, it's more of now a gender component to the term. So I usually just mention them all. And, that way I'm inclusive of all. But I understand there's not a right or wrong answer, by the way, Carol. And I think when people, as long as those terms, right? I mean, I've had people say, well, Spanish people. I'm like, well, that's just Spain, which is one country. And, certainly Spain and Espanol, there's that connection. But Spain is just one country. There's 24 other countries. So I would say stay away from the Spanish people. I mean, unless you're talking about Spain, which is Spain is from, they're Spain, they're from, Spanish people. But other than that, you will be safe to say Hispanic, Latino, I think. And you usually just, hash, you have your line, and it's as inclusive as you can get, because then you're including everyone. There is a lot of conversations, and I thought it was going to happen. Of course, the Trump administration kind of like derailed anything of progression with regards to inclusiveness. But there was, and I think maybe the Biden administration will pick up on this, is the idea of having Hispanic Latinos as its own race on the census. So that's not in place yet, but most likely will happen eventually. Because, it's hard to say, well, I'm a white Latino versus like a Black Latino, which could happen, right? You have Afro Latinos, you have white Latinos, you have indigenous Latinos, natives. So it is one of those where it's very rich and very diverse. But it's a great question, and I think your safest way is saying Hispanic Latino, and now you included everyone. Paola, do you want to add anything?
No, I was just gonna say that Latinos just refer to people living in Latin America, like you mentioned. That sometimes includes Brazil, because they speak Portuguese, and it's the Spanish Portuguese languages from the Latin roots. So that is everything I wanted to say.
Thank you, Paola. Cristina, anything else you want to add, mujer?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you mentioned it, Luz, but I know that I recently learned, because it is kind of like a new term for me. I mean, as much as you think I'm young, I mean, I'm growing too. So I think like 7 years ago, it didn't really exist, or if it did exist, we didn't really talk about it. But I know that it also includes the LGBTQ community. So non-binaries, binaries, and etc., and so it's super important to keep in mind. And on the chat, Angel mentioned that, Angel Castillo, she mentioned that, for example, she tends to ask, when she's in a conversation, she tends to ask the rest of the people what they prefer to be called, and so it's super important to keep that in mind. I think everyone feels comfortable with the different term, especially nowadays, since there's a lot of diversity. But yeah, it's super important to keep that in mind. Latinx, Latino, the difference between Latinos and Hispanics, as you mentioned.
And you're right. So one of the key parts, you're absolutely right. So the Latinx comes to be more inclusive of the reason why I say gender identities with LGBTQ issues, because the language of Spanish has a very gender identity component of so they're trying to be as inclusive. But I think to Representative Spagman-Moss' point is there's been some resistance of older Latinos that are saying, please don't make it more complicated. But I think it's just the nature of our new generations as well. Great, thank you for that, Cristina. I have another question, Cal. We're ready for you.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Escamilla. Hope you and your family are doing well. I enjoyed knocking doors for you way back when. And Cristina and Paola as well. I have two questions. When you look at the state of Utah and the growth, do you view kind of the urban-rural growth in the community? Maybe give me a sense of that and us a sense of that. And is the messaging different in terms of whether it's Washington County, rural pockets up in Logan versus, say, Metro Salt Lake City? And then the second question is immigration. What is in your view, in a very complicated year with Republicans still talking about walls and TPS and keeping people out, what's the best way to bridge into that important topic?
Of course, always an excellent question, Gal. You're probably one of the most knowledgeable people I've met, and thank you. You were so wonderful putting of your time supporting me before. So let me start asking. That's a great question. That rural versus urban, Hispanic Latinos and the growth. So I learned this during COVID, right? I remember being in a call with legislators. This is when we were barely, getting those numbers increasing, maybe May of last year, and, big chaos. We could only meet online. And I remember some of the senators being very upset about, mask mandates, of course, and everything else. And, he was telling me, in my entire district, Senator, I only have 3 cases. And he was right. This is rural Utah. And I'm like, my household triples your number of cases, right? It was telling, because he wasn't lying. He was absolutely right. I mean, there were some counties that have no cases of COVID. And then we have Salt Lake City. Well, we had, I think at one point we had 39% positive COVID rates of Hispanic Latinos in Salt Lake City. 39%. I mean, just imagine that we're only 14% of the population and we had 40% almost. So there are going to be differences, and those are, those differences are going to be owned by those communities. I mean, it's like any other community between being in rural areas and urban areas. I think being Hispanic Latino is still going to be your number one. People ask, like, what does that mean when you have different cultural identities and you're trying to identify yourselves with them? The ones that are, you're going to have, like, I can't change the color of my skin and how I look when I get outside. There's other things that you may not know about me, and maybe it's my education level or my socioeconomic status. You may have a harder time kind of like guessing where that is, but my race and ethnicity, it is what it is, right? And that's why that piece is, it's just so obvious that for many, it's the first thing we identify ourselves with, because we've been pushed to that, not by choice. I don't choose to be, oh, hi, I'm Luz, a Latina, you know, sitting here. It's just how people treat me, it's how people see me. So I think that needs to be in mind. And I think Angel from Ogden was making some of those. Angel Castillo, obviously very knowledgeable as well, and has done a lot of work in Ogden and that part of town where there is also a lot of Latinos that have been for many generations there. So, you know, just that, recognizing that people, it's their experiences that are really what makes them react and do things a certain way. But yeah, you know, being urban and rural, it makes a huge difference in their experiences, regardless, I think, of race and ethnicity. Immigration, I'm gonna give it a try here. So the challenge with immigration, you know, still tied. And then you have certain US senators that have not been as Democrats that have not been as responsive. I mean, ironically, even I think Mitt Romney looks favorable, you know, on some of these issues. Utah tends to be on immigration always more progressive in an ironic way compared to other states. But you know, when it comes to what's going to happen, it's probably incremental steps. I'm sorry that there's some echo. And you're probably going to see the TPS DACA going first in an adjustment, and then something else. I don't believe we will be as lucky as to have a full comprehensive immigration reform in one bill, unfortunately. I don't see the appetite. I mean, there's still we're still paying the aftermath of Trump, guys. This is not over. Yeah, I mean, we don't want to even think about it because of PTSD, but the reality is this man is still out there. There's still a lot of people that want him, and they felt protected during the time to bring out the worst of humanity. So I mean, immigration reform is one of those, you know, areas and policies that are going to get hit through that process. So I will say DACA and TPS is what we're hoping first to address, and then move to the next one. Christina, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, Luz, just want to reiterate, I mean, I'm not an expert on immigration, but I'm passionate about it. And you're one of the people that I follow and learn from about this. And just want to reiterate what you've said. I mean, I also believe there's not a chance of immigration reform anytime soon. Like you said, that, I mean, Trump is out there, people that support him are out there, they still want him. And I mean, changes take time, especially something as delicate as this. And like, I agree with you when you say that DACA and TPS are our priority right now. I think we've seen a lot of positive changes in those two different aspects, those two different programs. I know Venezuelans they've benefited a lot from TPS. DACA, the young DACA recipients have done a lot of movement, and they've been amazing to kind of get the word out and make themselves known as well. And so I think that if we can continue to support that and support them, I mean, depending on what our immigration position is, but me personally, I find it super, super good to keep going at it and keep being educated about it.
Thank you. And it's why I believe we need a strong ballot up and down 2022 and 2024, because without Democrats speaking out on immigration, we're not going to find advocates doing it for us. That's my personal view. But thank you all for the very helpful information, and thank you for all the things you're doing every day of the week.
Thank you, Kel. And I know you guys are running out of time, and I'm getting my direction here. So I do have two people here, Rosalba and Alejandro. So Councilwoman Dominguez and Alejandro, I'll let you add something, Rosalba, do you want to go first, and then Alejandro, and then we'll have closing remarks by Paola and Cristina in a second. So guys, start thinking of your 30-second closing remarks, because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Councilwoman Dominguez, please.
So I just wanted to say like a few things first about my campaign. One of the biggest things that we did was we made it family central, right? Like my tias helped me sign my cards. My grandma helped make burritos for the parade. Everybody had a small role, whether they voted or not, or were able to. And that's, again, family centered. The other thing is really, and maybe this question is for Paola, is personally, what would you like to see from candidates and from other voters who are thinking and voting for on your behalf? Because I think that's important. Like, what are some of the things that we should be looking at directly?
Great. We'll let Paola, do you mind putting it in your closing remarks to answer to the councilwoman? Thank you, Rosalba. Yeah, Alejandro, and that will be our last question or comment, and then we'll go to our closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. I just wanted to put it in perspective. There's a lot of Latinos. There's all over the West Side. The feedback is killing me right now. There's a lot of Latinos in the West Side, and they need to vote. Many campaigns, even progressive campaigns, are not doing an effort to reaching out to those communities, to our community right here with Spanish literature. You will be surprised how many voters, they don't speak English and they want to be reached out. So we need to ask our campaigns, even Democratic campaigns, to reach out to the communities also in Spanish. So that's something that you could all do. Every time that you get involved in a campaign, ask them to make materials in Spanish. It is very important that we reach out to that community. If the Latinos voted in the West Side, we will not have any more competitive races in the Salt Lake County.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And with that, I'm going to now pass the time for our two panelists. Wonderful women. Thank you for all the work you guys do, for being so present in social media, but also in our communities. I think young people now sometimes just end up just doing social media, but you guys are out there on the front line. So Cristina, we'll start with you with your closing remarks, and then we'll go with Paola.
Yes, for sure. Thank you, Luz. Thank you for being here and for just being so present and wanting to make a difference and also connect with us Latinx community. Thank you for that and for being so open-minded. I think this is what we need nowadays, open minds and open hearts, because that's what it's all about, connections, relating to each other and working as one. And I invite you as a Voto Latino representative to join, reach out to us, message us on Instagram. We're as Voto Latino Utah, and I'll put it on the chat as well. We need your help. Let's collaborate and let's be one. And just want to reiterate what Alejandro said. Make materials in Spanish if you can, as an organization, include the Latino community in their language as well. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Cristina. And then Paola, we're ready for your closing remarks.
Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you so much, Senator Luz Escamilla and Chelsea, for inviting me. And just answering what Rosalba asked me earlier, I was just writing in the comments, I'll be so happy to be invited to meetings and that you have time to talk with our families, to visit our schools or workplaces and hear our stories or challenges, and also hear from you, right? We also want to get to know you, and that those eligible voters also get to know you and your proposals and all the things that you have to all the things that you want to do to support our community. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Paola. And with that, I want to thank the Women Democratic Club for always being there. I've always felt welcome and receive a lot of support and great friendships from this group. And I think the fact that you guys care and you're on a Saturday morning listening to this means the world. And we don't forget. I mean, that's the other thing our communities will remember. When you guys are there for us, when you guys are standing up on our fights And we are not afraid of fighting back and pushing back like we did during police reform, like we've done with the Bear Ears National Park, because it was affecting our brothers and sisters, our Native brothers and sisters, Indigenous communities. But we will take the lead. We just need your support as allies, and please know that that is recognized and respected. And I just want to thank everyone for caring and for being inclusive. And with that, I'll pass the time to Robin. Thank you again for letting me be part of this. And Chelsea, thank you.
It's awful. Excuse me. Is it still there? Yeah. Hang on. Is that better? No. I'm so sorry. Chelsea, take it.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I really appreciate it. Panelists, thank you so much for responding to my cold emails and Senator Escamilla tweet as well. I tweeted at you and emailed you, so thank you very much. And we will wrap up, I think, everything that we have in the chat and see if we can send that out to everybody, because there's some great information in there and calls to get involved. Thank you all. Have a lovely Saturday.